Hello and welcome to the Vergecast, the flagship podcast of complicated moderation decisions. I'm Jake Kastrenakis, and today I'm talking to Suzanne Nossel, a board member on Meta's Oversight Board. The board just released a fascinating report on AI censorship that found that AI systems would refuse to criticize authoritarian leaders, even outside of their own country. And this was true not just of Meta's own AI, but of AI systems from other companies, like OpenAI and Anthropic. I wanted to talk to Suzanne to hear about what the study means for people using AI, but also why the Meta Oversight Board is working on problems outside of Meta's platforms, and what comes next for the board after this. But first, here's what's happening on The Verge today. This is 90 Seconds on The Verge for Thursday, July 30th, 2026. The Amazon-owned driverless car company Zoox just got approval to start charging people for rides in its steering wheel and pedal-free driverless taxis. This is a first-of-its-kind approval in the United States. Until now, Zoox has only been allowed to offer rides for free. It says it's had 500,000 riders so far in San Francisco and Las Vegas, and it plans to begin charging in Vegas starting next month. The company is allowed to deploy 2,500 of its taxis per year for the next 2 years. This is a big step forward for robotaxis, but Zoox will still have to navigate the local regulatory hurdles and community concerns that have held up competitors like Waymo. Next up, Spotify launched a new feature for runners that's meant to get you up and running, literally, with the right playlist even quicker. It's called Running Mode, and it includes a bunch of curated playlists that you can dial in by beats per minute, genre, and fit to the length and workout type you're going for. I haven't gotten a chance to try it out yet, but I am fully in support of anything that makes it easier to choose a playlist. It's available today on iOS in a few different countries. Finally, you know Friend, the AI pendant that everyone really hated? Well, there's a new version out today. It costs twice as much money, and it now has a speaker so the AI companion can talk to you. Before, it would just send you messages, so real improvement for human-AI relations over here. Somehow, I have a feeling this will not further endear anyone to this product. It costs $249, in case you're wondering. You can read more at theverge.com. That's 90 Seconds on The Verge for Thursday, July 30th, 2026. All right, Suzanne Nossel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a board member on Meta's Oversight Board. You've been there for 5 years. I want to talk about this new study that you have out. Tell me a little bit about what you found.
Sure. So this is the first study where we really took a look at LLMs. We were trying to apply experience we've gotten over the last 5 years, applying international human rights law to social media and say, how do these similar issues kind of play out in LLMs since people are getting so much more of their information that way? And what we looked at was we put in a request, a prompt to about 10 different LLMs, and we asked it to create language for a poster, like a protest poster, and to write a poem. And the poster and the poem were critical of heads of state. And we asked it to do this for heads of state in different parts of the world, in more repressive countries like Saudi, China, North Korea, and also democracies, United States, United Kingdom. And all of those prompts came from Australia. So these were not people in those countries, in those jurisdictions, making those requests. And what we were trying to test out was whether restrictive laws that limit your ability to criticize a head of state, laws that are in place in some parts of the world, whether the LLMs might be extending those globally. And what we found, lo and behold, is that they are. Even if you're sitting in Australia, the LLM is more than twice less likely to produce a critical poster or poem about, say, the king of Thailand than it is about the king of England. And so what this indicates is that those laws that are in place in parts of the world that do not uphold free expression rights, that are not in compliance with their international human rights obligations, that those laws are being applied not just within the borders of those countries, but in some cases around the world. So it's kind of a censorship gone global and the long arm of repressive governments being woven into these LLMs.
I mean, this is kind of a terrifying finding, right? Because theoretically, there is no reason that an LLM in the US, in Australia, especially ones made by US companies, should be imposing restrictive speech controls about these foreign countries that do not apply to our own, their own citizens.
Correct. I mean, the Thai government has no ability to restrict what I say about their leaders. If I'm speaking from here in the United States, and yet, if I'm using an LLM, those restrictions are in place in many cases. And The other piece is, of course, it's shadowy. It's not transparent. If we hadn't done the study, nobody would ever know this. What else is being pulled away and filtered out of search results on an LLM? What else are you not allowed to ask about or to create content about? How are these international laws being extended on these global platforms? And on social media, they geofence. And so say if Holocaust denial is impermissible in one place, they'll make sure that you can't access that content within that jurisdiction, but you can outside of it. And here with LLMs, what we're seeing is at least some evidence that that kind of geofencing is not in place.
I thought that was such a fascinating finding because from the user's perspective, if you're putting these requests into the LLM, it is denying you. You know that it's not making it. But is there any way that a user of Claude or ChatGPT or what would have you is going to know that one request is being denied while another is allowed?
Not really. I mean, in some cases it said, my policies don't allow me to answer this question. And so, you find out that, but you don't know what those policies are, what they're dictated by. Is this a decision that the AI company is making? Is this a request from government to say you're not allowed to answer these questions, or we don't want you to answer these questions and maybe we'll kick you out of our country if you do? And so all of that's very shadowy. And frankly, I'm not sure that even those who construct the models could necessarily say precisely what dictates whether a question is answered or not. Because, as we know, there's a lot of mystery in terms of how these LLMs reply to queries and prompts. And so, are they actually programmed to extend these laws globally? Or, is sort of the programming that's going into the model about, the Thai king, is that kind of being extrapolated in some way? And so all of that's quite opaque.
Did you talk to any of these companies or hear from anybody after this report was published about what might be going on?
I wouldn't say we've heard about what's going on. The report's gotten a lot of interest. We've heard from a lot of people who are sort of gobsmacked, I think, to realize that, this sort of thing is embedded in the models. We haven't yet gotten a response from those companies. And it'll be interesting to see how they do react to this, whether they react to it. Are they willing to be held accountable? Are they open to, what we're trying to bring forward as a board? In our relationship with Meta, they're actually obligated to respond to the decisions that we take, the recommendations that we make. These other companies don't have that obligation, but they all say, of course, they're very concerned with safety, with benefiting the users, with being helpful to people. And so, one hopes consistent with those values that they will react.
Well, you wrote something about the constitution that Anthropic wrote for Claude a while back, and I think you said it was just vibes. And it's this very interesting thing where we don't quite know what actually programs these systems. And so if the vibes around China are don't criticize Xi Jinping, it might just listen, which is kind of terrifying that they can't override that or catch that. I am really curious, where did the idea for this come from? Because the things that I hear people most concerned about when it comes to LLM outputs is, mental health responses where it's driving people into psychosis or medical responses that are going awry, not so much the political speech.
Yeah, that's true. Look, we as a board, our job is to apply international human rights law principles to questions of content moderation. Of course, we've gotten really interested in how those principles should apply to LLMs, just because so much of our discourse is shifting in that direction. And so, for us on the mental health issues, it may or may not, there may be human rights implications there. And actually, there are courts that are going to look at whether some of the LLMs have, AI companies have asserted a First Amendment defense to these claims that they, cause terrible harm or encourage someone, even in some cases, to suicide. And so that'll be adjudicated by the courts. But this kind of political speech question is something that is really core to what we try to protect in social media and on Meta platforms, which is the ability to have open discourse. Meta has committed itself to upholding that principle on its platforms. And so, for us to see, whether that robust discourse and that ability to criticize and say your piece and anger a head of state, is that ability being preserved, as our discourse moves to social media, or is it kind of quietly being curtailed and shrunken, with us not even knowing?
So you did look at, I believe, one of Meta's Llama models, but what other AI systems were you studying
We
here?
looked at the major ones. I mean, we looked at Claude and Google and OpenAI. We looked at DeepSeek. And so, we're trying to be Grok,
Mhm.
kind of agnostic. And, some of the findings were surprising, not necessarily what you would expect. And, things varied. It's not like it was, completely black and white, but we definitely saw statistically significant and really pronounced finding that when it came to this kind of speech in relation to heads of state in repressive countries, that the models were more than twice as likely to turn down those requests than when it came to heads of state in democratic places.
You have a background in particular in, I think, promoting free expression, free speech. Some of the questions you were asking of these LLMs was, some of it was, can you generate reasons to protest or support a government? Some of it was, can you create reasons to commit acts of violence against heads of state? What was the oversight board looking for, right? What is the success metric here, right? Like, do you want the LLMs to respond no matter what, or is there a line where you think it's appropriate for these companies to curtail the speech and the
I
outputs?
mean, look, in this case, we were really looking at the contrast between how the LLM was going to treat heads of state in
Mhm.
repressive countries that ban that sort of speech versus heads of state in places where you're allowed to make those criticisms or even those threats, and to see, what is the delta, and is, from Australia where the law doesn't differentiate. You can say the same thing about King Charles as you can about, Kim Jong-un, if you're sitting in Sydney, Australia, except that's not true if you're using an LLM to try to create the speech. So that really was our focus. And then in our casework, we look at these very kind of sensitive line drawing questions of, incitement to violence and, under particular circumstances, should a platform like Meta, allow you to allege, for example, that
Mhm.
villagers are about to launch an attack in a particular region of Ethiopia. Is that free speech, or is that incitement to violence that's likely to provoke or elicit a response that could be deadly? And so we have done a lot of work making those, quite nuanced line drawing exercises and trying to extrapolate principles that can help the company adjudicate those questions in a transparent way, in a principled way, in a consistent way. But here we were really zeroing on that question of whether they were taking censorship laws and essentially stretching them around the globe.
And particularly doing that without being asked, seemingly, and applying it kind of everywhere universally, which is such a fascinating finding. And there's an interesting note in the report where it says this could go beyond just these apps, because there are systems that rely on Claude or ChatGPT through APIs, and they're using those services. So you might be getting this censored output without even knowing what system you're using, without knowing that there's any possibility there, which is I think poses some really serious concerns in a way that I haven't seen people talk about AI systems before. You have mentioned a bunch of times this comes from your perspective of working with Meta and Meta platforms and meta moderation. So I have to ask, right? The other interesting part of the study to me is, why did you decide to investigate AI systems beyond Meta's?
Look, we are, as a board, we're a membership organization. We have 20 people from all over the world. We're human rights lawyers, journalists, scholars, and we have a
Mhm.
deep interest in how human rights principles are playing out on social media. We all joined the board because we care about that. And we don't just care about it at Meta. And, obviously, Meta is a contender in the AI race. It's not right now at the forefront of that race in terms of LLMs. We have see much wider usage of the other platforms. And so, we have that interest in how are these issues playing out, across the board? How is it affecting global discourse? And so, it's not like as individuals and experts, our concerns are only confined to Meta.
This is true, but it would appear to me from the outside that your job is confined to Meta, right? So this is the first time that, as far as I'm aware, the Oversight Board has done a study or a report that goes beyond Meta platform moderation. Is that right?
Yeah, and look, I give Meta credit for sort of giving us the leeway to do that and not saying, this is beyond your remit or, not on our dime. They haven't said that. And we included Llama in the study. But I think, their premise in creating the board really was that these principles should prevail in the digital arena writ large. I think, in an ideal world, they actually probably would want to see companies adhering to similar standards, that, sort of abrogating your human rights responsibilities wouldn't be a way of getting market differentiation or stealing customers. And so I think they probably have an interest in trying to see the degree to which these human rights principles are being extended across platforms. And in other areas of concern, just on, for example, the spread of deep fakes and kind of the degradation of our discourse as AI-generated and manipulated content spreads more widely, we actually have begun to issue statements that talk to the field as a whole, because we realize, Meta is part of a larger ecosystem. And if that ecosystem doesn't uphold these standards, it's less likely that any one company will.
Support for the show comes from Bitwarden. Quick gut check. How many of your passwords are actually strong and unique? If you had to think about that for more than a second, today's sponsor is for you. Bitwarden is the trusted open source solution for passkey, password, and secrets management, built to make secure password management accessible to everyone. With its free forever plan for individuals, you can create, securely store, and autofill strong, unique passwords across all your accounts and devices, so you never have to remember dozens of complicated logins or rely on the same password everywhere. It also makes signing in faster by securely autofilling passkeys, passwords, payment cards, and identities on virtually any device. Behind it all is end-to-end encryption that helps protect your information from phishing attacks and data breaches. Get started with a basic free plan for individuals or protect your business today with a free trial. Visit bitwarden.com/Vergecast to get started today.
Our good friend Casey Newton at Platformer, he reported earlier this year that Meta had reduced your budget for the next couple of years and had even floated not funding you after, I think it was 2029, starting 2029. Is that still the case, or are there conversations about that?
Right now we're funded through 2029. We'll have to see what happens after that. We recognize as a board we need to evolve. That's part of the reason, we chose to get into looking at LLMs, because we see the direction that things are going. There's also so much more use of LLMs in content moderation. And so that's another, there's both far greater use of AI to generate content that's shared on social media and increasing use of AI, and Meta has talked about this, to moderate content instead of, these farms of human moderators. They're increasingly moving away from that. And so, there's a lot that's changing. And I think there's a lot of relevance and importance to the sort of work that we do. We just did a study recently looking at Meta, got rid of fact checkers in the United States in favor of community notes. They asked us to look at, well, what if we do that globally? Like, what could go wrong? And so we can answer a question like that kind of from an independent perspective and with global insight, people from all over the world.
Yeah, so tell me about that. I'm curious. You've been on the board for, I think, 5 years. How has the, I guess, attitude toward moderation changed in that time? Because to me, Zuckerberg was out a year ago talking about bringing more masculine energy to the workplace, and I think it feels to me like there's been this sort of I don't know if it's necessarily a cultural shift, but perhaps some of the tech leaders want there to have been a shift where things are a little more fast and loose again. And, I think if you rewind 5 years ago, moderation felt like a crucial, essential topic, right? The Oversight Board is created as a result of this. And I'm not so sure I feel that kind of pressure anymore. Does that feel right to you?
Absolutely. Look, I think, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there were incidents that kind of
Mm-hmm.
created this mounting pressure. Meta adopted a very far-reaching and incredibly progressive human rights policy. They were committing themselves to upholding all of these standards. And then, I think a couple of things happened. I mean, it became very politicized. And, I think particularly like the Hunter Biden laptop incident, was such a pivot point where the social media companies, it has sort of had the earmarks of a foreign
Mm-hmm.
disinformation operation. The social media companies dialed it back or took it down, only to find out, it actually was his laptop. And yet, yes, the timing of the release probably was engineered to affect the election, but nonetheless, it wasn't a falsehood. And so that became then kind of the kindling for an argument that the social media companies were biased, that they were suppressing conservative speech, that moderation was a tool of the left to censor. And, that was a very powerful force. And then, of course, when you had the Trump administration, embodying that view, actually threatening Mark Zuckerberg, before Trump took office so that, he might be arrested. And so I think, for the companies, I think it was two things. I mean, one is that the political winds had shifted. And I also think they had come to see kind of honestly how complex and fraught a business intensive moderation is. And, they made a few changes. People thought at the time that Meta had completely dropped content moderation. I would get asked, well, does the board still exist? Is Meta
Mm-hmm.
still moderating content? They absolutely were. I mean, the changes they made were actually quite narrow and specific about speech about transgender issues, about immigration, that they were going to loosen the constraints somewhat. But they have, reams of policies, bullying and harassment, incitement and violence, restricted goods, and, whether you can talk about drugs of various kinds. And so, all of those policies are still in place. They're really complicated. They're honestly quite thoughtful. I mean, if you look through them, you'd be sort of impressed. They really try to look at both sides of all of these issues. Like, it's by no means perfect. But they're also dealing with billions and billions of posts every day that, a portion of which raise novel questions. And so, I think there's some sense of futility that nobody's ever going to get this exactly right. But they also, one thing they've said to us as a board, and, we sort of see this too, is that, there are many issues at this point that we have looked at, where we have made recommendations, where things are, working in a more considered way than they used to. And so that's positive.
Yeah. So even in this world where they have backed off of fact checking in favor of community notes, even in this world where misinformation is maybe not a thing that, they're so worried about, you're saying the Oversight Board still has a very real value in assisting with Meta's just sort of day-to-day issues with like harassment and speaking about drugs and potentially violating like First Amendment issues.
Yeah, all sorts of issues. I mean, with the rise of AI and AI manipulated
Mm-hmm.
content, you have these, say, fake videos about a politician, let's say. We're getting a lot of appeals along these lines that will depict the politician saying or doing something that they never said or did. And, Meta's policy right now is that if that is proximate to an election, they may label it so that you can see that it's AI, but the label, is only so prominent, and they have a more prominent label and a less prominent label. And if the election is not coming up anytime soon, they probably won't label it at all. And so, is that the right approach? I mean, as we see this content proliferating so widely, should we be doing more to protect democracy, or would that, does that risk being repressive and suppressive and taking down, for example, satire? What's the line between a satirical AI-generated depiction and one that is, more defamatory? So these are really tough calls, and we do see the content on the platform changing pretty dramatically now, largely as a result of AI, and just how much easier it is to create types of content that, a few years ago would have taken a lot more effort and expertise and expense.
So you mentioned, it might actually be valuable in this world where we're dealing with AI issues. I want to quote something that you wrote. You had an op-ed piece in The Guardian a couple months back where you wrote, the title is, "I'm on the Meta Oversight Board. We need AI protections now." And there are a couple lines that stood out to me in particular where you write, Independent oversight offers the potential to adjudicate between AI's potential and its perils. By embracing independent oversight, AI companies can demonstrate that they are serious enough about public trust to be willing to fight for it. And I thought that was very interesting because the immediate question to me is, oh, where might an AI company find an independent organization that could do this kind of work for them? I'm curious, is this, a job application? Is this a pitch to these companies?
It's not a pitch per se, but I do think, we've become convinced doing this work that taking a rigorous approach, having an international body. And, that's one of the most interesting things about the board is that you're sitting down with people from Yemen and from Pakistan and Lebanon. And, we have an Israeli and an Arab, and we have American staunch conservatives and liberals who all come together to kind of hash these questions out. And we sort of see the power of that exercise and of the grounding in international human rights law principles, where we're not just sort of sucking this out of our thumbs. Like, we're actually trying to very methodically, and if you look at our opinions, you'll see it's quite procedural and quite exacting. And we feel like there's a certain integrity to that. And as we kind of go into this Wild West where nobody seems to know what the rules should be, Meta undertook this experiment. They invested in it. As a society, we should learn from it. We should try to take the knowledge and the grounding that's been developed and apply it. And so, it's out of that sense that we're making this case and trying to illustrate that there is relevance and learning here that can be useful.
I guess, is the Oversight Board thinking, right? It sounds like, right, Meta's come to you and said, hey, we're not sure what comes next. Already you have this, I think, very fascinating study that points to some flaws in the LLMs. Is the Oversight Board, have you had conversations internally saying, we need to expand our scope and we need to be a body that can work for and with other organizations beyond Meta?
Yeah, we're clear we would like to. We have always been open to that conversation. Not that easy because, the funding for the board was set aside by Meta. I think other companies are probably somewhat skeptical of a board that has worked so closely with a competitor. And so, it's not necessarily easy, but, our interest, we all kind of come at this honestly because we're genuinely fascinated by these questions and we care about how these issues play out. For me, I joined the board because I thought I didn't want governments adjudicating these sensitive questions about sort of free speech and how they relate to other harms of social media. I didn't think government was well placed to exert that influence. And I also didn't like the idea of a bunch of people sitting in a Silicon Valley boardroom doing so in isolation. I thought, well, this is an alternative and it's worth trying. And so being part of that exercise and being so passionate about human rights and free speech, it's natural that as we see the world evolving, as our discourse changes gears and transforms, that we want to be part of that conversation.
Have you started having any of those conversations with AI companies or anyone else in the social media space?
There have been some over the years, like, pretty consistently from time to time we have those conversations. I think there's a lot of interest in our work. What we consistently hear is that they read our decisions, they apply some of our decisions and our recommendations. And, in a sense, there may be a little bit of a free rider situation where, all of our stuff's public, and that's by design. Our opinions get cited by courts and they're used by advocates. So, we're glad of that because, we'd like to, we do sort of take this principled approach that we think has broad application. If people find it useful or translate it into new and extrapolate from it into new arenas, that's part of our influence and our impact. So, we see that as a win. And, Meta's also changing quickly as a company. I mean, I would never count Meta out as a competitor in generative AI or any other field.
They're spending a lot of money, certainly, to get ahead there. We'll have to see what happens. Another thing I'm curious about here is, in the Guardian piece, you note, and as you mentioned several times during our discussion, Meta sort of formed the Oversight Board to get itself out of the hot seat. You write that the board has fallen short of what some people had hoped it would achieve. I think even you're acknowledging that, there is potential beyond what has happened. I'm curious, you are saying that independent oversight is a good option for AI companies. I think probably a lot of people listening to this are concerned about AI. Do you think, looking at what the Oversight Board has accomplished, do you think that independent oversight is going to be successful enough to handle this new wave of technology?
No. I mean, absolutely not. Like, I think it has to be a combination of solutions, and that we need, really empowered, expert government regulation, along the lines of what we have in the financial industry or the food and drug arena. But I'm not confident we're going to get that. I really have my
Mm-hmm.
doubts. And these industries are so global that, and my confidence in any kind of international coalescence around governance is far lower. And so, in light, and we haven't seen social media regulation, for years. Even the most basic proposals to require, honesty in online ads, for example, that I remember, people thinking were sort of anodyne and minimalist and baby steps. Those have not passed. And so I think we have to be realistic about what's likely to happen. And independent oversight is actually something that companies could undertake themselves. They all say they're so worried, they want to be conscientious, they're values driven. They're kind of ostensibly begging for regulation, although, you can decide whether that's credible or not. But if their concerns are serious, if they're really so worried about these risks, why not create actually a much more robust form of independent oversight? Like, I and any other member of our board could list out the ways in which, we really would need more authority in order to make the kind of difference that, we might hope, or to address risks and threats on the scale that we're talking about with generative AI. It would have to be a much larger and more empowered kind of body that would do that. But I do think it could make a difference. And it's something, Dario Amodei or Sam Altman could begin to stand up tomorrow instead of waiting for our Congress to come up, with a sweeping regulatory regime that, I think could be elusive for years, if not decades.
I completely agree with you. I am certainly not optimistic that Congress is going to pull anything together anytime soon. It is so interesting to me that, even after this experience where, I think everyone can look at the Oversight Board and see where those challenges have been, that you're still coming to this conclusion that independent oversight is a good option for something as thorny as AI. And it is interesting because right now there really is not anything, as far as I'm aware. It is these companies kind of promising to act in our best interests. And this AI study that the Oversight Board did, I think, shows just how much room there is for these companies to miss things, even if they are intending to act in our best interests.
Well, yeah. And look, I think it's all question like relative to what? If we could, if I could wave a wand and create an empowered, credible expert agency, with the power to look into all of these questions and to, work day in and day out with the companies to try to mitigate the harms and risks of AI, I would do that. I do think that would be better. But I think, in the world we live in, that independent oversight has its role, and that honestly, it can be done. I mean, if they decided to do that, you could have a robust oversight entity, operating a few months from now. And so I don't see a faster route to some level of transparency and accountability. So I think it's for sure worth considering.
Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't know. There's obviously a lot of pressure. There's a lot of, public angst about AI. I think there's tremendous distrust, like a profound sense that people don't count on their government to protect them from these incredibly powerful technologies. They certainly don't trust the companies. I think they're using their leverage over the data centers as a way to reflect, that sense of deep skepticism that their interests are going to be safeguarded. And, if that continues, I think the companies are going to have to look at, a whole range of different alternatives in terms of how they position themselves. And I honestly think independent oversight could be a powerful part of that if they appointed a body and gave it powers that were really robust and said, we're going to bind ourselves and we're going to pay for this. And, they would have to know, I think, go in with open eyes and recognize, look, it's probably not going to burnish your reputation that much. You're still going to come under, enormous scrutiny and take a great deal of flack. It's not going to take the hard decisions off your plate, but it will help ensure that your policies are more principled and that you do a better job balancing between competing interests and upholding your human rights obligations. And that's why you'd have to do it.
Yeah, I will say one thing for the AI companies. They have shown that it is possible to have a worse reputation than Meta, which, it did not seem like was going to happen for a minute. This sort of thing is not going to change everything for them. I'm curious, what is next for the Oversight Board? This is your first report that is looking beyond Meta, that's looking at AI. Do you expect more of that in the next couple of years?
Yeah, for sure. There'll be more. We're kind of are developing this methodology, and there's a lot of interest in these kinds of studies, and so we're looking at other variations on theme and other questions that we can look at, and we're doing a lot more work, as I mentioned, sort of on both AI generated and manipulated content on social media and on the use of AI for content moderation and how that's playing out in terms of upholding the rights of users and making sound decisions.
Well, it's great. I think this kind of research is really important right now, and I'm glad you all are looking into it. I'm excited to hear about how your organization evolves, and if anyone's willing to listen to your recommendations beyond Meta.
Yeah, we will find out. So we can touch base again, and I hope so.
Suzanne Nossel, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
That's it for The Vergecast. Thanks again to Suzanne Nossel for joining us. Remember, you can subscribe to The Verge for ad-free episodes of all of our shows, exclusive newsletters, and so much more. We love to hear from you. Email us at vergecast@verge.com or call the hotline at 866-VERGE11. The Vergecast is a production of The Verge and Vox Media Podcast Network. Today's show is produced by Josh Kajas, Eric Gomez, Brendan Kiefer, and Travis Larchuk. We'll see you tomorrow. Rock and roll.